morning, everyone. Hope you're doing well. I want to start off this morning, before we look at the passage, by saying something that's true of me. Maybe it's true of you. I don't know. I love a BOGO deal. I love a buy one, get one deal. So I do most of the grocery shopping in our family. And guys, in Western PA, where we recently moved from, BOGOs were not a thing. I don't think so, right, Chelsea? There weren't any grocery stores that did BOGOs. So I'm like, what is this land called Florida? You know what I mean? Where I can walk in and buy, because I need one wishbone dressing, and walk out with two wishbone dressings. You know what I mean? Or in the ice cream BOGOs, my kids have never eaten so much ice cream in their life. It's because I don't know what we used to try to give our kids healthy food. Now I just buy tons of ice cream because it's all buy one, get one. It's like I can't pass it up, right? So I still am like a pretty committed Aldi shopper. But Aldi doesn't do the BOGO, you know? And so I have to stop in at Winn-Dixie now and take advantage of it. I think Publix does BOGOs too, right? When I buy, a BOGO deal, it reminds me of like the system that we live our lives in as Americans, really every part of our life, that goes something like this. There's a market or a market mechanism or an algorithm, that somehow anticipates my needs, right? And so I don't know how Winn-Dixie knows when I need coffee. But guys, it does. The timing is impeccable. I don't know how it knows when I need more, sparkling water in the fridge, but it knows. And I walk in and I'm like, man, however, like, this, right? Like, it's not just some, like, local grocer in the back of Winn-Dixie, like, organizing these BOGOs. They have some kind of software program, right, that is timing this out. There's, like, market research that's been done. Of course, Facebook, Instagram are even freakier with this because I can just, like I said wishbone dressing here today. Probably my feed is going to be filled with dressing commercials, right? Somehow we're being listened to, friends, right? I felt that today when Bree was like talking about fears, like, I don't know, the government. I'm like, yep. That's not even a full sentence, but I know what she means. And so it's like we're being listened to, right? And somehow anticipating my needs. And then when my need is met by the market, by a BOGO deal or some other kind of equivalent, I walk out of the grocery store actually with more than what I need. You should see the amount of chicken broth in my cupboard right now. We don't even have room for this, you know what I mean? But I'm like, BOGO, And so I buy chicken broth, too much of it, right? And then the market also encourages us then to throw things away as soon as possible. So I forget where I was driving from recently, but it took me down by the bay where the garbage dumps are. So I hadn't seen that lovely part of Tampa yet. So I got to see that the other day, and I was reminded the huge mounds, of trash. There's some writers, thinkers, Wendell Berry being among them, that just say, like, this has only been happening, this cycle I'm describing, for a few decades, really. And we have yet to understand the psychological, the relational consequences of this kind of cycle that we live in, the consequences for the earth, for our ecology, right? That we now find ourselves in, where our every need is anticipated, or at least it feels that way. It's like I don't have to verbalize it. It just comes at me, through an advertisement or a BOGO deal. I can barely walk into Winn-Dixie without. Sometimes I go in there just because it's bad and I'm stuck on this. But it's like I walk in there sometimes just to pick up one little thing. And I cannot pass those BOGO bins. Like at the beginning, I'm like, we need this. My kids need this right now, right? That anticipates our needs and then gives us more than we need. And then we discard it so we can start the cycle again, right? I imagine we probably already should have some kind of clarity on it as a society, as a people, but I imagine that as time goes on, we're going to discover more and more what this does to us as people, right? What it does to our souls. We may discover what it does to the earth after it's too late. But what it does to our souls, what it does to our relationships, right? How it views, how it affects the way that we view one another. Danielle already said that last week Hannah spoke to us about anxiety from the letter to the Philippians. And to a degree, she was hitting on this. Maybe the opposite of anxiety, or somewhere in the territory of the opposite of anxiety, is gratitude, right? Rather than being worried about the future, we can be grateful for the present. And Paul reminds us today that that's possible even in difficult circumstances. These are the final remarks of Paul's letter to the Philippians, and it's been good to be in this letter together over these last few weeks. And his remarks, as he closes out his letter, are aimed at the occasion that the letter was written in the first place, which is him expressing gratitude and thanks. As a leader in the church that has been put in prison, as himself in very difficult circumstances, and he's expressing gratitude to the church in Philippi that sent care to him through Epaphroditus, a friend of Paul's, to care for him in his needs. We can assume that Epaphroditus brought some provisions with him, but also just his company, his care for Paul. And now Paul models to us what gratitude looks like. So I'm going to read Philippians 4, 10 through 23. And then we'll do our Bible study at our tables together. By the way, do you notice that today we have a mega table over here? How about this? How many of you have watched The Office? Mega desk, right? You catch the reference? I'm like, this is mega desk over here. Okay, let's read this passage together. Philippians 4, verse 10 to 23. I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Yet it was good of you to share in my troubles. Moreover, as you Philippians know, in the early days of your acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out from Macedonia, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, except you only. For even when I was in Thessalonica, you sent me aid more than once when I was in need. Not that I desire your gifts. What I desire is that more be credited to your account. I have received full payment and have more than enough. I am amply supplied now that I have received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent. They are a fragrant offering, an acceptable sacrifice, pleasing to God. And my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus. To our God and Father be glory forever and ever. Amen. Greet all God's people in Christ Jesus. The brothers and sisters who are with me send greetings. All God's people here send you greetings, especially those who belong to Caesar's household. The grace of the Lord Jesus Christ be with your spirit. Amen. It's our practice to take some time at our tables to discuss the passage. The people who are at your table, just take some time to share with one another what you notice, what questions you have, maybe even what the Spirit of God is highlighting for you. We'll take just a few moments to do that. Okay, friends. We'll bring it back together here. Would anyone like to make an observation or share with us a thought or a question, something that you were talking about at your table that we could all hear and reflect on together? Is there someone who would like to share? Yes, go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, he specified that it's not about the gifts, but it's actually just the thought, like their actions that mattered. Like he didn't care, like the gifts could have been very simple, but to him it's just like, no, it's the fact that you gave me aid, that you cared for me. And yeah, I remembered him.
Yeah, that's a really great observation because this is a very relational passage, right? We're going to talk about that. All of this expression of generosity, receiving generosity is in the context of relationship. And I think you're right, Ryan. These gifts were probably not very much, actually. Like Paul calls them more than enough, but a large percentage of this church was probably very poor, right? So it may have even been something modest, right, that Paul received from them, because he's sure to tell them it's more than enough. But you're right, there's a relational dynamic happening. Yep. Stacy? Oh, sorry.
Okay. I was just noticing that he feels like he's drawing a connection between our ability to be content and our ability to be generous.
Yeah, that's right. There's a posture in this. Yeah.
My church upbringing, before you give offering, they would always say this prayer, 19, my God will meet all your needs according to his riches and glory. So it always felt like if you give, then you're going to get back every time you gave, every Sunday. And I don't know, I just really was touched by reading it in context that maybe the needs, like the God meeting your needs in this passage is referring to the contentment that you feel whether you have or you have not. Like that's what you're going to get, not necessarily like monetary need met all the time. So yeah, we were talking about the secret of being content at our table, and that the gift that is.
Well, this is awkward, but now I want us to all say verse 19 together, and then we're going to take an offering. Just that's actually what we had planned. Sorry, is that okay? No, but I think that is a really great example of how the cultural market context that I was referring to a moment ago affects our reading of Scripture, right? We do live in this market that was not, ancient kings didn't have access to the kind of, quick material and pleasure that we have access to, right? And so that has so affected how we view even God working in the world, right? That I go into Winn-Dixie, I scan my app, which is a great app, by the way. You really should. This is turning into a commercial for Winn-Dixie, but but I scan my app, I pay my money, and I get something back instantly, right? And we begin to think, oh, this is maybe how it works with God too, or this can be really damaging. That must be how it works with each other, right? That's not always how it works, right? And that's not what Paul's talking about here. It's a great observation. Maybe one more.
I was just wondering about the strength that the Lord must give us in plenty and in want. And if that strength is different, if it's the same strength, usually I'm thinking when I'm in plenty, I am strong. I don't need strength. And when I'm in want, I need strength. That seems more obvious to me, but this seems to say you actually need strength for both. The Lord has to give you strength when you have a lot and when you have very little.
That's really
you
good.
need strength for both. But I don't know if it's the same strength or what.
That's really good. Dang it, that should have been my sermon today. Now I feel insecure up here. That's awesome. We are going to reflect on that verse, though. All right, obviously, we're kind of zeroing in on it as a room that the key to understanding the passage that we're reading today, the focus of it is verses 11 and 12. Paul's description of his interior posture of contentment. And this basic principle of contentment, of course, is mentioned elsewhere in the Scriptures. It shows up as early as the Ten Commandments, that are given from Mount Sinai when we are commanded to not covet, right? To want something that somebody else has. It's contentment that causes us not to covet, right? Even think about Job, which is probably earlier in the scriptural discourse than anything, saying the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. There's something about a kind of holy kind of detachment, even from the things that have been given to us, that allow us to depend on God and makes room for the work of God in our lives. Of course, Proverbs in the Old Testament is filled with all of these warnings and wisdom about having a lot of possessions or having few possessions and how to navigate that in a godly way. And this is in the territory of some of the favorite things that Jesus liked to talk about, certainly in the Sermon on the Mount, but also in the parables. Jesus taught us that we should ask God for our daily bread, but have this day-by-day dependence on him, that if we're hoarding things, it harms our neighbor and also reveals something about our heart's lack of dependence on God, right? So this is a pretty sweeping body of teaching throughout the scriptures. And the failure to find ourselves at home in contentment, right, sets in motion all kinds of consequences, both personal and social and systemic, that ultimately leaves us depressed, unsatisfied, weary from always having to chase the next thing or compare ourselves to other people, and, albeit sometimes unintentionally, oppressing other people and populations of people. I don't have to tell you that the level of material wealth we experience in the United States is only made possible because of people and places that have less power, right, than we do. And there's a dynamic of oppression in that. There's a real sense in which a lack of contentment is what creates those garbage dumps down by the bay, right? It's a physical artifact of what happens in a society when a society can't find contentment. But what I want us to notice today, and this is maybe even a little distinct from some of the other scriptural teachings on contentment, but Paul highlights it for us. I want us to notice, especially today, the relational context of contentment that Paul is hitting on here in his relationship with the Philippian church. His exhortation isn't simply about contentment from a material perspective, but about the relationships within which contentment can be experienced and how contentment can then affect those relational dynamics. Because Paul talks about contentment here in a very personal and relational context with the church that he loves, do you notice all of the nuance in this passage, all of the paradox in the passage? Paul says things that on face value might even seem like they contradict each other, but he's trying to get to a very nuanced place about how he views the gifts he's received, the obligation that the Philippians and him feel toward one another. And all of this leads Paul to describe his relationship with this church with gratitude over their gifts. So it's this nuance that I want us to focus in on today. This paradox that Paul bounces back and forth between as he talks about the gift that he's received from the Philippians through Epaphroditus. So let's explore that together. On one hand, this is one side of the coin, Paul has no expectation of the Philippians that they will fulfill his needs. Do you notice this in the passage? In verse 11, he says, I'm not saying this because I am in need. Now, we know he's in need. He's going to say it in a minute, but he's talking about something fundamentally true about what's in his mind and in his soul, how he depends on God. He says, I'm not saying this because I am in need. That's verse 11. Verse 17, he says, not that I desire your gifts. He's like, I haven't been sitting here in prison thinking that you need to send me a gift, right? He has not placed the Philippian church, as dearly as he loves them, and as much as he knows they dearly love him, he has not placed them under obligation to fulfill his needs. It's worth saying here that this is leadership, right, at its heart. And here at the Underground, we've actually tried to find ways to express this in ways that matter for all of us, in how we talk about leadership and how the covenants that we sign and the agreements that we make with one another, that part of what it is to lead is to not put the people that we're leading under obligation to serve us, right? That's the wrong flow, right, of care and concern. There's something about leadership, that we see in Jesus that's always going to think about the other person, and Paul has that. Also, in just a very mature and kind of in touch with reality way, Paul says in verse 10 that he understands that no matter what the Philippians might have wanted to do, that maybe they just didn't have the opportunity to meet his need. Maybe for whatever reason, it just wasn't possible. We don't know all the specific circumstances in that. But Paul just understands it might have not, even if they wanted to, it might not have been within their power, right, to meet the need as quickly as they would have wanted to or something like that. So all of those statements from Paul are kind of one side of the coin. But on the other hand, and in paradox to that, Paul has no problem expressing another set of his reality of his experience to them. First of all, just that he has troubles. He says this in verse 14. He can admit he's in touch with reality. This isn't some kind of like denial, like I'm fine. We all know someone who's like that, right? They're definitely not fine. But it's like, I'm fine, all right? Paul has no problem saying, guys, I'm not fine. I'm in prison, to be clear. Like I have troubles. He's already talked about his suffering in this letter. He has no problem saying in verse 10 that he's glad that the Lord alerted the Philippians to his troubles, right? And stirred up their hearts to do something for him, to care for him. He has no problem in verse 14 saying that it was a good thing for the Philippians to share in his troubles. This isn't some like sanctimonious thing in Paul where it's like, no, I'm the one suffering. I don't want to trouble you. I don't want to. He's actually like, no, it's actually good for you to enter into this suffering with me. He sees some kind of spiritual benefit for them in participation. He has no problem in verse 18 saying that their generosity to him is actually a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God, right? That the way that they're caring for him is actually an act of worship to God. He has no problem saying in verse 17 that this is somehow credited to their account, that this has spiritual benefit to them, and that God himself will somehow remember it, right? And reward it. And in his affection for the Philippians, he has no problem saying that their generosity has somehow made them exceptional in love, right? That there were times when no one else was willing to give to Paul, but the Philippians did, and that matters to him. He's willing to acknowledge that as an exceptional display of love. So all of this paradox raises a question for me. How could both sides of this coin be true? How could Paul all at once have no expectation for the Philippians to fill his needs, no desire for them to, he even says, and on the other hand, be able to name his needs honestly and rejoice that they have responded and to see the hand of God, the grace of God in that response? I think the answer, of course, is contentment in verses 11 and 12. I think sometimes as God's people, we are vulnerable to two different relational realities that I'm going to talk about, kind of the opposite sides of what I just said. Two relational realities that sometimes have their source in our pride. Sometimes I'm not sure it's pride. It's just a kind of brokenness in us that gets in the way of contentment and what Paul is talking about here. And I think this is where we can get stuck in our relationships with one another, because this is relational contentment we're talking about today. On one hand, sometimes we fall into the trap of having unrealistic expectations of others to fill our needs. Right? And we'll explore that a little bit today. I think sometimes other people, I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to the person next to you, for sure. I'm definitely not talking to me. All right? Sometimes we have unrealistic expectations of others to fill our needs. On the other hand, sometimes we fall into the trap of not being able to name our needs or show our needs to our sisters and brothers. We're not able to admit that we have needs or to receive help in the place of those needs. So there's this one side where sometimes we begin to have unrealistic expectations of each other, right? We might think that the people around us should somehow know our needs and respond, right? Sometimes, is this getting piped into the kids thing somehow? Can they hear us back there? I'm about to talk about one of my children. I'll let you guess who it is. That's right. Sometimes my 8-year-old, just because she's at the age that she's at, sometimes we'll hear her back in her room, and all of a sudden she'll go, back there. Go back there and see what it's at. Isla, what's going on? I'm hungry and no one will give me food. What do you do with your child in that moment? You coach them to what? Use your words, right? Don't growl at me. It's like, don't assume that we were sitting around just wondering if you were hungry, and trying to time our approach, right, in the right kind of way. It's our role as parents, or if you work with kids in some other setting, to coach them. This is actually part of like emotional health and just maturity and being able to name your needs to other people in a healthy way, right? A child who doesn't learn that, right, and grows up without that skill, being able to advocate for themselves or say what they need, right, is not going to be a healthy adult, right? And yet, sometimes we revert to that kind of childlike behavior, right? Where it's like we think somehow the people around us should anticipate or know, what we need before we ever say it. Then we might think that once they do know that we have some kind of need, that they should be able to respond. That this should become priority for them, right? That they should drop everything, right? And help us because they know that I have a need. And we might think that they are actually obligated to respond to us. That this is what it means for us to be part of the same house church. This is what it means for us to be part of the underground, right? Is that you're actually under obligation, right, to care for my needs. We might never have talked about it, We might never have, a lot of expectations have never been voiced, right? But we do expect it, from each other. And we have a demand because we think that, and we spiritualize it, right? It's like, no, you're obligated because you're my sister. You're my brother. This is what it means. We put that obligation on them. If we begin to think in these ways, it will cause, I'll just talk for myself because I know you don't have these problems, so it's just me. If I begin to think in this way, it will cause me, even unconsciously, to begin to extract from you what I think I need, right? Another way to say that is to manipulate you. I will begin to try to pull out of you, even if it's in passive ways, what I think that I need from you. My wife and I haven't done it for a long time, but we, over the years, have done like premarital counseling for couples. My wife is a therapist, so she's really the one doing it. I'm just like along for the ride, right? But I think one thing we've talked to every couple about as they prepare for marriage, but it's just true in our friendships, our everyday relationships as well, is that if we put each other under those kinds of obligations, you know what we're doing? We're saying that we need this other person to be God for us. Think about it. I want them to anticipate my needs, to be able to see all my needs. I'm demanding, if I think that, I'm demanding omniscience out of you, right? It's a high bar. and then if I think that you must meet all my needs instantly or something, I also think you're omnipotent, right? And Chelsea and I have told a lot of couples that you will be sorely disappointed if you think your spouse is God. Your spouse might be a great spouse. I promise you they're a horrible God, right? Your friend might be a great friend, but I promise you your friends make horrible gods, right? They're not omniscient. They're not omnipotent, right? They're very limited like you are. Now, I know all of this cognitively, but I can tell when I'm in this place. Here's how I can always tell. It's because someone doesn't meet my need, whether I've spoken it or not. They don't meet it in the timing that I wanted them to meet it in, whatever it is, and I lose my emotional equilibrium, right? I'm hurt or upset or angry or sulking or something, right? That's how I can tell. Even if I never consciously said, oh, my friend is God, right? Or Chelsea is God. Even if I never said those things, you can tell that somewhere along the way I began to believe that, right? If my emotional equilibrium or the lack thereof reveals it. Paul doesn't assume any of these things with the Philippians. He doesn't assume that they're under obligation. He doesn't assume that they should know certain things. He doesn't assume that they would know his needs without saying that he's in need or hearing, right, of the nature of his needs. And in this way, he maintains his dependence on God, and also, and I think this is important for our relationships even with each other, he retains his dependence on God, but he also maintains the liberty of his brothers and sisters. He does not make his brothers and sisters slaves to his need. He's not willing to make the Philippians slaves, right, to what he thinks he's needing. He's contending for their liberty, even as he's able to name his own needs. So that's one thing we can slide into. On the other hand, and especially for a community of missionaries like ours, I imagine this might crop up sometimes. It does in me. On the other hand, we might fall into the trap of not being able to name or show our needs, for whatever reason, to our fellow brothers and sisters. That might be out of pride. Like, I might not think you're God, but I might think I am. You know what I mean? Like, I don't need anything, you know? Like, I'm good, you know? I don't need anything from you, right? There's a kind of pride, but sometimes it's not pride. It can be other things. It can be a warped sense of spirituality that fetishes suffering, right? That somehow makes suffering some kind of like, I don't know, sign of maturity that you don't have. Notice Paul, through this whole letter, has been able to talk about suffering openly, even the way that like God works in suffering, the spiritual value of suffering, without making a God out of suffering itself, right? He, hopefully like us, is longing for a new heavens and new earth where suffering will be no more, right? Even as he believes that God can work redemptively through suffering in the here and now. But he doesn't make suffering some kind of like, I've met Christians like this. Like I bet you have too, that it's like, they want to tell you about like all the hard things they're going through, but not so you can help them. It's like, oh no, I don't need anything. This is God, right? Which is in this passage. I don't think that's what is happening with Paul. There's also a kind of brokenness that assumes I'm not worthy, right, to receive someone's help, that my own wounds somehow get in the way. There's all kinds of reasons. That kind of attitude and inability to receive help from other people can lead to pride. I've already mentioned that. But it can also just lead to ungratitude for your sister or for your brother. Either way, whatever it does, it often leads to a quiet resentment, doesn't it? An unspoken resentment towards my sister or my brother, right? It's easy to notice the failings in my brother or sister when I've never allowed them to give to me. And I've never allowed gratitude to rise up in my heart toward them, right? When I've never allowed God to use them to meet my need, well, what's left then is me just observing and critiquing them, right? It's easy to begin to think that somehow I'm more spiritual or something like that. And tragically, this set of attitudes actually causes a blocking of the way that God wants to work among us, to care and provide for us. Do you notice Paul is able to talk about the Philippians and the way that they're giving and the way that he is receiving, but he sees the hand of God behind it. He assumes that the way God works among us is through our generosity. As however God is going to provide for me, part of it is going to be through you. That's how this thing works, right? However God is going to provide for you, somehow it's going to be through me, right? That God stirs up our hearts in love for each other. And when we're too spiritual or too prideful to be able to name our need or receive from someone else, we're actually getting in the way of the flow of God's grace among us, right? And friends, none of us are too spiritual for the grace of God. Come on. No one is at some spiritual level, right, where they're too spiritual for his grace, right? Too spiritual for his generosity. So for me, I can tell when I'm in that place, when I begin to disassociate from my brothers and sisters, when I begin to feel a lack of gratitude for them, when a quiet resentment begins to grow in my heart for them, sometimes it's because I actually haven't put myself in a position to receive from them in a long while, right? One of my mentors, this isn't in my notes, but one of my mentors told me a long time ago, he was like, Joel, when you're too prideful to receive help, or and this was a problem for me, guys, because I grew up as a kid like having to survive. If you grew up as a survivor and managing other people's emotions in the household and all these things, you can fall into the trap of thinking like, I got it. I'm good. Like whatever's in front of me, I've been through worse. So some of you have that, right? And it can be hard to put yourself into a place to receive. And so over the years, I've had some mentors speak to this, gently in my life, when they've noticed it and been like, hey, Joel, someone offered you something and you denied it. Why? Why'd you do that? Why can't you receive God's grace, through another person? One of my mentors one time told me, he's like, Joel, when you feel like you're unworthy or you're strong enough or whatever, and it doesn't let you receive, he was like, it's easy to begin to believe that nobody loves you, that no one, around you cares for you or whatever, because you're just out here surviving, He was like, but when you put yourself in a position, right, where other people can help you, where you can name their need to them and they can give to you, he said, you start to realize that people like everywhere love you, And friends, there's people in our microchurches that are surrounded by people who love them. And somehow they can't receive it or see it, right? In part because they can't receive from their sister or from their brother. So, what is centering for Paul between these two extremes that we can fall into? Well, of course, it's contentment, right? Paul knows what it is to be in plenty and in want. I think that's just experientially true in Paul's ministry the whole time. There were good seasons and bad seasons. Seasons where people were listening to him and being converted and churches were starting. Seasons where he was getting beat, right? And run out of cities, right? He's like seen it all. But I think particular to the Philippians, I think he's hitting on something about this season of his life. He knows what it is to have lots of care and attention from the church, for people to really be locked in on his needs and be caring for him. And in this case, he also knows what it is to feel forgotten in prison, right? To be sitting in jail and wondering, is anyone thinking about me? Does anyone know I'm here? Have people forgotten about me? Have the churches that I started, do they care at all, about what's happening? I think he knows what it is to be in both of those places. To know plenty from his brothers and sisters, and to know want from his brothers and sisters. I think he knows both. Either way, he has learned what he calls a secret. Secret, not because it's not taught openly in the scriptures. I already said it's all the way through, the Bible. But it's secret because it is rarely experienced in our BOGO culture, right? Rarely experienced by the wider culture, to be content either way, right? No matter what comes, no matter what happens. I think Paul models for us what it means to be able to say that we are in need, to be vulnerable, to let other people see it, that's humility, and to trust in God. But if we don't get what we need, if you can't give it, or even if you don't care, it doesn't mean that I'm going to fall apart, right? It doesn't mean that I'm unloved. It doesn't mean that God's promises aren't true. It might hurt. Like if you're mean to me and you don't care, that's going to hurt. But also it doesn't have to shake my identity, right? That ultimately it's God who cared for me, because this is what Paul says. We know that God is our strength. If I can just make a few applications to microchurch leaders. Friends, we have to remember this teaching that we're exploring today as a family of microchurch leaders. It's the only way to stay free, right, in what God has called you to do, and God wants liberty for you, right? So it's the only way to stay free, and it's the only way to protect the liberty of the other people in this room, right? Is to somehow be real and vulnerable and name our needs, and also understand that we are not God for each other, and that we need God to do what only he can do. We can experience God's grace through each other, but at no point do I become God for you, or you become God for me. When we can see each other actually as people and not God, it's amazing how much compassion we can have for one another. It's amazing how much room there is for people to grow around us. It's amazing how much selfishness we can overlook. But if I begin to think that you're God, then I'm going to have a protest in my heart, right? Because I'm going to be very disappointed in the kind of God that you are. So it matters for us as an underground family. But also in our microchurches, I just mentioned my daughter growling in her room and expecting that I know her thoughts, right? Just realize that Paul is a leader modeling something. I think what he's doing is very intentional. He's modeling it for the Philippians. I was reflecting this week on this reality as I was looking at this passage of how much of this kind of coaching I've had to do, not just with my own kids, but with the people I'm leading in microchurch life. Because they're going to come to you and be like, nobody here cares about me. Nobody knows my needs. No one, and not, please don't demean one another. I mean, be gentle and kind to one another. But I can't tell you how many times Chelsea and I have had to say to a leader, well, does anyone know about your need? Have you ever taken the risk to say it, right? Sometimes as a microchurch leader, my tendency is to want to just jump into advocating for them and being like, oh, they're upset, so other people need to know, that they're in need. My wife has been a good voice for this in my life. It's being the best gift we can give people is to learn to name their own needs, to learn to say it, hey, can I sit next to you while you share with the group, what you need, but can we get your need out there? Because we have to coach people. It's guys, this microchurch might be the best microchurch in the world, but these people aren't actually omniscient. They're not omnipresent. They're not omnipotent. And they're not God, right? And so we have to turn people's attention back to God. And I think if we jump in and rescue too much, because we want to hold things together, then we will actually communicate to people that we think we are God, right? We have to coach people in the kind of contentment, redirect people in the kind of contentment that Paul is describing here. But maybe here's another application for microchurch life, and that it's wherever you serve, particularly if you serve really broken people. I don't know that I can say everyone. I can't make a blanket statement, but I would be shocked if you didn't get into that on some level because you had some need that needed to be met. It was true for me when I started working, with kids in a public housing community. I never would have been able to say it to you. I didn't have enough self-awareness at age 20 to be able to say it, but I got into that in part because I had needs that needed to be met. I felt like I needed affirmation or purpose or something. And let me tell you who definitely cannot be my God. It's kids experiencing poverty in a public housing community. Let me tell you who cannot be under obligation to us, right? It's people who don't even have enough power and resources to make it through today, right? Much less somehow affirm my need to be needed, right? Or something like that. Now, even if you're unaware of those dynamics, here's what I would say. Still serve. This is actually some of the gift that the poor give us is they will not care what you say, talk about, or what you care about. They will not listen to you. They don't care about your 501c3. You know what I'm saying? And somehow that's actually a gift to us, particularly if you come from a background with more resources, because it turns your heart to trust in God again, right? Like so many of our neighbors experiencing poverty have to trust in God every day. I've learned a lot of this posture of contentment by watching my friends experiencing poverty, particularly who are believers. I shared some of this story at the college retreat last weekend. I'm not going to get into as much detail today, but because I shared the story at the UGC retreat recently, she's been on my mind. A friend of mine that lives in a town about 2.5 hours from here, it's mostly migrant workers who live there. And she came to the United States with her husband. They started working in the fruit fields here in Florida, or orchards. I don't know the terminology. Whatever you call them. I just buy BOGO food. So started working, and then her husband left her. And she was left with 2 kids in a new country, just in a really desperate situation. And I happened to be in town with a group of teenagers from Aliquippa who themselves were from a public housing project. And we were doing a thing where we would pray together and just say, God, is there someone's need that you would like to connect us to today? And friends, I was doing this with kids who didn't grow up in church. They're not, all churchy and all that, and all of us can take on that posture. If they can do it, you can definitely do it. All of us can take that posture of just saying, God, what are you noticing today in my community, in my city? Is there a way I can help? Is there a way I can be of service? Send me on an errand, if you have something for me. So we were kind of doing that activity intentionally with the kids. And long story short, we ended up under a tree looking at an apartment building, or all these guys gambling and drinking in front of the apartment building. And the kids had gone there because, and I don't have time to tell you the whole story, but they had felt like God had told them that if they went and stood under this tree, that maybe there would be a woman that would approach us, and that there would be some kind of assignment from God in this. So it's like, why not? It can't hurt, right? Let's go stand under the tree. So we go stand under the tree, and we're watching all these people, gamble and drink, but there's a woman. And she keeps looking at us, and she eventually walks over, introduces herself, and says, hey, last night I had a dream. And she said, in this dream, God told me that people were going to come stand under this tree, and that they would be able to help me. Now, she was in great material need, but also she felt so discarded because she was so committed to her marriage, and then her husband had left her, and she just felt like God couldn't use her anymore, right? And we began praying over her, and right away she had like this encounter with God. We actually spent the rest of the afternoon ministering in those apartment buildings, really just following her around. She was preaching at one point in the courtyard, and people were gathering. It was a day I will never forget, just to see the Spirit of God come on her and lift her up again. But here's what I noticed in my sister, and I've remained friends with her all these years, and I still notice it in her. She has no problem saying what her needs are, because she doesn't think she's super spiritual because she doesn't have needs. That's not what it is to be spiritual, right? Her spirituality is wrapped up in being utterly dependent on God every single day. Like, she needs God to do something. She doesn't have trouble telling that, to her friends. She saw the hand of God in sending us to her, right? If we hadn't have come, I don't think she would have renounced her faith. If we hadn't have come, I don't think she would have abandoned Jesus or complained about the church or, all these other things. On the other hand, she was so glad that God sent someone because she needed help, right? Because she was stuck. And she was glad that someone showed up with a hug or a prayer or a word of encouragement or something material because she was in a desperate place. I've seen this posture over and over again. And my brothers and sisters who have very little, I'm going to close with this. But even though my friend models this so well, can I confess something to you? I have preached messages like this before, for sure. I would even say some of the verses here, verses 11 and 12, have kind of been key verses for me at different points in my life. I've preached it, And then I've turned around and just been so disappointed and angry when my needs aren't met by you, right? And then when I experience that hurt, I'm tempted to stop expressing my needs. To be like, well, that must be what it is to be spiritual. So stop telling people, right, what I need, to stop letting people see it. Chelsea and I went through some hard things relationally right before we came here, and I had preached messages like this years before. And then all of a sudden I found myself angry and sulking because there were some people who I thought should have known better, who I thought should have been able to give me what I needed, right? And here I am, like my 8-year-old again. You know? I knew something was off in my soul, and so it was like, I got to get around Jesus. You know, so my friend invited me to a prayer room in another state, and I went, and I'm just like in this environment of intercession, and a prophetic word comes forth in the room, and it was around these verses. You know, these exact verses 11 and 12. These verses were read, and a prophetic word was given, and here's what it was. If you don't have it, you don't need it. And if you need it, God will provide it. If you don't have it, you don't need it, guys. You know, if you feel like you're missing something relationally, we're all missing something relationally. But at a fundamental level, if you don't have it, you don't need it. And if you need it, you have a Father who loves you. He will provide for you. He will take care of you. Paul is like so confident in this. So I admit that even though sometimes I've preached it, there's a kind of contentment that sometimes still eludes me, and that's bad news. So what's the good news? It's verse 13, and it's not just a slogan for Steph Curry's shoes, right? It's verse 13. I can do all these things because he gives me strength. That somehow there's a way our souls can be brought to rest and contentment in God's love. If we could have some music here, we're going to wrap up. Somehow there's a way that God can remind me of his love again, of his concern for me, that he is God and that other people are not. And somehow when my soul's content in his love, it means that I'm liberated. It goes all the different directions. I'm actually liberated from the obligations you might put on me, which I'm glad because I have a God that I trust, right? So I don't want you to be my God, actually, you know? But it also means that like I don't have to put you under my obligations. And also, I can come to you in a time of need and say, hey, I really need someone to listen to me. I really need someone to pray with me. I'm trying to do this thing over here, and I just really need some help. Could you help? And if you say yes, that will bring so much joy and comfort to me. It may be a way that God works in my life, but if you say no, it doesn't mean that I'm a piece of trash. It doesn't mean that you're evil, right? It means we have a God who is God and somehow fills in the gaps of our limitations of love for one another. It allows us to experience both the joy of meaningful relationship and connection without being enslaved by those same relationships and connections.